Has it ever occurred to you that your dog can tell when you're sick? We're going to talk about this and so much more on today's episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. I, as always, am your host, Dr. K, and I'm here to guide you through yet another story chronicling the lives of the tiny and infamous, and that would be, of course, the incredible and the amazing bacteria. Thanks every single one of you guys for tuning in for another episode. We have a really cool set of stories, or I guess just one story, to talk about today, uniting things like bacteria and disease and animals. It's a really cool story. We're going to jump into it in a second, but first, don't forget to hit that like, share, subscribe button if you're listening to this podcast on YouTube. If you're listening to this podcast on some other kind of podcast medium such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts, don't forget to hit that follow button to help support the channel. Anyway, enough of that. Let's jump into the science of the day. I guess the best place, as I mentioned a second ago, this is uniting a whole bunch of different things. We're talking about animals, we're talking about bacteria, we're talking about disease. Let's put this all together in this really cool story. And I guess the best place to start is to talk about the smells that humans produce. You may be aware of this. But humans actually produce a whole bunch of different kinds of odors. We produce a whole bunch of different kinds of smells. And now this is going to vary actually based on a whole bunch of different factors. It could be based on your microbiome, the skin microbiome that is currently coating you. That influences the smells that you produce. Your hormone profile, that can influence the amount of smells that you produce. Your genetic profile, that can influence the types of smells that you make. Right? There's a whole bunch, or your environment. There's a whole bunch of different things that go into the smells that an individual human would produce. Now, if we zoom in on those odors, right, you'll find that the things that are producing those odors are these molecules called volatile organic compounds, also known as VOCs, but we're going to call them volatile organic compounds. So these are organic compounds that produce odors that we can pick up, right? And like I mentioned, they can be produced by our skin, they can be produced by our breath, anything that is going to produce some kind of odor from us, it's going to be producing it in the form of these volatile organic compounds. Now, like I mentioned, there are some instances where there's more or less of these compounds, but you might be aware that the vast majority of these compounds we don't actually pick up. We can pick up really dramatic instances of it. Like I mentioned, in some instances, some folks make a lot more, so we can pick it up because there's so much more, since there are so many more compounds. But we don't actually pick up a huge amount of them. And the reason why is that we don't have a very sensitive nose. If we think about it, we are upright animals, right? And the first thing that we do whenever we're running into something novel is, instead of smelling it, we're going to look at it. So our primary sense is our eyes. We're looking at things before we start smelling at things. And as a result, that means that our noses just aren't the most sensitive, right? So that's our first point. We produce a whole bunch of organic compounds in the air that is the basis for the odors that we produce, but there's a whole bunch of these compounds that we don't actually perceive because we just don't have a particularly sensitive snoot. Now, as I mentioned a second ago, there's a whole bunch of different factors that go into the compounds that we produce, these organic compounds that we produce that give rise to odors. All right, there's a whole bunch of different factors that play into that. I mentioned hormone profile, I mentioned genetic profile, I mentioned microbiome. Another thing that influences this is disease, right? This is actually a pretty well chronicled fact. And in the article that we're talking about today, they talk about this. That depending on the disease, you can produce different kinds of organic compounds. Sometimes you may see this, like if you go into a household where everybody is sick, you can kind of smell that there's something off. There's some more dramatic instances of this, like for example, and the article mentions this, you can smell the scent of acetone on somebody if they have ketoacidosis. Another even more dramatic one than that and less well known is something called maple syrup urine disease. Yes, I said that correctly. That is maple syrup urine disease. This is when someone's urine has this kind of like sickly sweet maple syrupy smell. And this is when the body can't produce a few specific types of amino acids. Okay, so the main point being here, and this is our second major point, is that while we have a whole bunch of what I'll call standard organic compounds that we produce based off of our environment and genetics and hormones and microbiome, when we get sick, we can alter the composition of those compounds, or we alter the types of compounds that we produce. So that's the second point. Now, it's probably about this time that you're like, well, gee, Dr. K, I'm very smart, and you kind of tipped your hand earlier when you said something about dogs and animals. Would it be possible then for us to train animals such as dogs to detect different kinds of diseases because they have such strong noses? And this is why, my dear listeners, this is why I sample only the smartest and wisest of listeners for this podcast, because you are 100% correct. That is a fantastic idea. And it turns out there are a lot of folks that are working on this. And the reason why is that animals like dogs and rats and cats, right, they have extremely sensitive noses, right? The article that we're referencing here, it points out that dog noses are 100,000 times more sensitive than our own, which is hard to even comprehend what on earth that would mean, because we smell something and like, oh, well, that smells pretty strong. Now imagine smelling that at 100,000 times the same smell, right? That's an incredible, incredible thing. Rats, as it turns out, have even more olfactory receptors than dogs. So both of these guys, dogs, rats specifically, and these are the ones that I'm going to talk about today, they have extremely, extremely sensitive noses. And again, this makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. When dogs and rats are trundling about, their noses are forward, right? They're closer to the ground. They don't use their eyes the same that we do because we're these upright animals. Dogs, rats, they have their nose forward, they're low to the ground, and so the first thing that they're going to be using to interact with something new is going to be their nose. Okay? So, point number 3, animal noses, super, super cool, and they're extremely, extremely sensitive. Now, it's right here that we're going to start introducing the research. There's a ton of cool examples of how researchers are using animal noses as a way of identifying disease. And in particular, there's one out of Tanzania. Yeah, out of Tanzania. And these folks, what they're trying to do is they have this big problem. And this big problem is that there's a lot of folks that are that have tuberculosis, right? And the bigger issue, right, is that it's kind of expensive to test for whether or not there is tuberculosis present in a person, right? So the main point here then is there a way that we can minimize the amount of resources they have to spend on tuberculosis tests and still be able to identify whether or not someone has tuberculosis? Okay. Now, the researchers in particular were focusing on using rats as a way of identifying whether or not someone has TB. And what they did was really, really cool. So they figured out that when somebody has tuberculosis, right, tuberculosis is going to be producing 13 specific volatile organic compounds. I mentioned these volatile organic compounds earlier on. So tuberculosis is going to produce these 13 specific compounds when they are present in an individual. Now, what's really, really interesting is that rats, because of their really, really sensitive noses, were able to identify any combination of 6 of these organic compounds. So like I mentioned, tuberculosis is producing all 13 of these compounds. And so maybe there's like a little cluster here, and here. But the rats, as long as 6 of those organic compounds were located in an individual, then rats could pick them out of that sample. They could say, oh, there's tuberculosis found in this person because at least 6 of those organic compounds found in tuberculosis are found in this person. It was actually a really, really cool way that they did it. They gave this rat like a tiny little banana and avocado smoothie, and so then whenever the rat would pick up on the sample and would identify, oh, look, this is where the tuberculosis is present, then they would give him a little bit of the smoothie, and then the rat would be oh so happy, and then they would use that as motivation to try and keep finding more folks with these tuberculosis organic compounds, right? So at the end of the day, then they had a rat that was able to pick out when somebody had tuberculosis, and all they had to keep doing was keep feeding it this banana and avocado smoothie. So that's really cute. In addition to rats, dogs also are being used as a way of sniffing out disease, so to speak. Turns out that dogs are pretty good at picking out cancer out of a complex group. There was a 2019 study. It's also going to be linked in the description here. And what these folks were doing is they were testing specifically for breast cancer. And so they found out that if you gave dogs these 4 different samples, and in these 4 samples, 1 would be cancerous and then 3 would be non-cancerous, and you just keep giving these groups of 4 to dogs, dogs could pick out the signature of these, based off of these compounds or these organic compounds. They could pick out the signature, the cancer signature of the disease 90% of the time, right? That's absolutely wild. And so again, and this is our 4th point then, not only are animal noses amazing, but when they're put in conjunction with these researchers, then they can help us determine who has a disease, whether it be tuberculosis or even cancer. This is so cool. What's really awesome about this, again, is that it really doesn't, apart from the training, it doesn't cost any money. It's not invasive at all. You're just having a rat or a dog walk up to you and then tell you whether or not you have cancer or tuberculosis. So you can manufacture these things at scale. And so who knows, by the end of this, maybe we'll have a whole army of rats and dogs that are just going to be able to trundle on through a population and say, all right, you have tuberculosis, you have cancer, blah, 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 blah. Really cool. Anyway, let's wrap this up for today. Our first point, we produce a number of organic compounds in the air that are the basis for the odors that we produce. And a lot of these we don't actually perceive because we aren't primarily smelling animals. Our second point, when we're sick, we actually produce a new flavor, so to speak, of these volatile organic compounds. So we produce a slightly different scent profile. Our third point was just that animal noses are super cool, and they're extremely sensitive. And we talked about rats and dogs. And then finally, when we put all this together, not only are these animal noses amazing, but when researchers used and trained these dogs and rats, and they were able to help us pick out who had different types of diseases, whether that be tuberculosis or whether that be cancer. Super cool. Really neat set of articles for today. Be sure to check them out. Overall, guys, we are on a quest to help minimize the impact of diseases such as tuberculosis and cancer all around the world. And happy joy, lo and behold, it turns out we're getting some help from our cousins in the animal kingdom. So if you have a dog nearby, don't forget to give it a pet on the head. Or if you have a rat nearby and you have a couple of bananas or avocados handy, be sure to give it to them as well and thank them for their help in this fight against disease. But that is all I have for today, guys. Thank you so much, every single one of you guys, for tuning in. And I hope to see you guys again next week on another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria.